Hello, welcome to my history podcast. Historian Michel Trujillo once argued that a site such as a town or a village offers a particular configuration in time and space of the processes that affect the nation. It is a conjuncture, an empirical moment in which those processes merge concretely within the daily existence of specific historical actors. A historical city or town is the very materialization of the history behind it. The architectures, urban spaces, social policies, and all geographical specific actors in the site often represent the ideas and intentions underlying those tangible and intangible urban assets. But today, we're going to pinpoint our focus on a small town in Europe, which is one of the very few attempts in the history of humankind that forthright aimed at the creation of the ideal place, the utopia, and to be precise, the socialist utopia. After World War II, a new district arose from the ruins of East Krakow, Poland. It was one of the two bold urban experiments carried out by the socialist regimes in Europe. It is Nowa Huta, the first planned socialist district. From 1949 to 1956, roughly when the Stalinist system flourished and failed in Poland, the socialist reformers decided to build a district that embodied socialist ideas and incarnated this perception of a socialist utopia. This place, focusing on steel industry, was carefully designed for over 40,000 residents of different races and ethnicities. In this podcast, I will guide you to this utopia, Nowa Huta, to show you the history behind the model socialist town. I will demonstrate the radical ideological influence of socialism on the town's tangible urban design and architectures, as well as the intangible, cultural, and social phenomena. I will also lay out the historiography of the town, especially by examining the biases of the narratives of the history. Finally, while I will not argue whether the socialist utopia is good or bad, feasible or infeasible, I will emphasize that the mainstream Western narrative developed in the Cold War era, that the fall of Nowa Huta was a failed socialist attempt marked by political censorship and oppression, was only part of the story. The ideological influence of socialism gave birth to a new identity in Nowa Huta in the 1940s and 50s, which led to the upheavals in late socialism era and shaped the solidaristic pursuit of an egalitarian society in the 1990s. Now let's begin with how Nowa Huta, through its urban design and civic policies, built a new identity of Polish called the New Man. In February 1949, the Polish government started to build enormous new steelworks 10 kilometers east of the center of Krakow. Soon, reports described how a new city would be built alongside the steelworks to host its workers and their families. Premier Józef Sierakiewicz's of Poland proclaimed that the new town would bring winds of change and give the city a socialist imprint. The town was named Nowa Huta, meaning the new foundry or the new steelworks. Geographer Maurice Ciesinski argues that socialist ideology was characterized by a strong structuralist belief that social and living conditions create the individual, his or her personality and value system. Socialist leaders believed that the new ways of organizing the home, the workplace, or the street would produce new social relations and would, in turn, produce a new consciousness. The socialist architect and urban planner thus became an engineer of the human soul. There are two photos of the overview of Nowa Huta taken by Paweł Jaglow. The left one shows the general plan of Nowa Huta, and the right side one shows a view from the central plaza. We can easily find traces of socialism, egalitarianism, unification, and other utopian ideas in the formation of the urban spaces and structure of the buildings from these two photos. The general design of the urban space is clearly formatted across the land, with streets expanded 45 degrees from the center. If we look from above, the city is symmetrical and divided into blocks separated by vegetations. Housing estates designed for 4,000 to 5,000 people were built around public utilities and services like kindergartens, schools, playgrounds, and parks. Life in these clustered estates was self-sufficient. Which serves as the center of citizens' daily life, hence forming a strong community-centered value. The larger urban layout is spatial, ordered, and peaceful, while creating an utopian environment. Uniformity was also essential to the design of the architectures. Each building was of the same height, same style, same design to create a single uniform sense. All of the architectures have 6 floors so that no one is higher than the other. The design of the buildings, known as the representative of socialist realism, annihilated class differences and aimed to represent equality among every citizen in the city. Uniformity was also essential to the design of the architectures. Each building was of the same height, same style, same design to create a single uniform sense. All of the architectures have 6 floors so that no one is higher than the other. The design of the buildings, known as the representative of socialist realism, annihilated class differences and aimed to represent the equality among every resident in the city. Lastly, the urban design focused a lot on residents' well-being and health by its mass use of green plants between buildings. The concept of Garden City, which intended to create self-contained communities with proportionate areas of residence, industry, and agriculture, was upheld by the socialist government and resulted in the spatial and peaceful environment. Apart from the urban design, the lifestyle in Nova Huta, shaped by the government's urban and civic policies, also embodied the ideological influence on history of the city. In fact, to say those are policies is an understatement. The plans carried out in Nova Huta resembled more to a guidance of life, a rule of how people should live in the city. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, under the 6 Years Plan, which aimed at rapid industrialization and steel production, Nova Huta's economy heavily relied on steel industry. Every citizen, regardless of their race or gender, received education and skill training, particularly for producing steels. The unemployment rate was virtually zero, since everyone's job was planned. Everyone had the same amount of salary, the same time of vacations, and paid the same price for the same commodities. Everyone was treated and expected to be equal economically, culturally, and politically. This equality was not the mere equality we talk about in today's society. It was a socialist egalitarianism, which put a lot more emphasis on uniformity. For example, the government expected everyone to be a communist, and that religion was strictly prohibited in the town. If you look at this photo, you can also observe the identicalness of the clothes hanging on the rope, which belonged to steel workers. Such uniformity penetrated all aspects of life in Nova Huta. As I argued, the urban design and lifestyle shaped by civic policies manifest the socialist influence on Nova Huta. As a model socialist town, Nova Huta became an amalgamation of socialist ideas in the 1950s and helped create a socialist identity in the city, a new man. This identity was planted and printed to every person who became a citizen. Before talking about this identity and its influence, I will first acknowledge some historical lenses and narratives in the historiography of Nova Huta, particularly addressing the Eurocentric approach and the ideological confrontation from Western researchers, which I would argue prevents a critical understanding of the Newman identity. There are two influential books on Nova Huta. One is Unfinished Utopia, Nova Huta, Stalinism and Polish Society, by Catherine Laval, and the other is Nova Huta, Generations of Change in a Model Socialist Town, by Kinga Pozniak. Together with other researchers who focus their analysis on social anthropology and architecture history aspects of Nova Huta, such as Pozniak's article on the collective memory of the city, Bolosław Janus' analysis on high culture in Nova Huta, and other papers on post-socialism reform in the town. However, just as Pozniak admitted and pointed out in his own book, the Western lens on the narrative of the history is biased towards Marxism and socialism. It is widely conceived that memory is an important component in projects of European integration, since it is seen as the means of forging a shared identity among EU member states. And in fact, European Parliament's 2009 resolution on European conscience and totalitarianism states that Europe will not be united unless it is able to form a common view of its history. When Europe is trying to form a common, uniform view of the history, which focuses more on the negative side of the Soviet history, a non-anti-socialism perspective is silenced. The mainstream historiography characterizes the history of Nova Huta with authoritarianism, oppression, and loss of freedom. Charles Drodzinski even argued that the buildings in Nova Huta were the architecture of fools, while others like Borowczyk, Kulubek, and Patkama think that socialist industrialization failed in the city. Few scholars have mentioned other interpretations of the history and attempted to find new narratives, but it doesn't mean that we can achieve a one-sided conclusion on Nova Huta. As Pozniak wrote, to be sure, Poland's socialist era history undeniably consists of experiences of repression, resistance, and inefficiency. However, it also consists of other experiences that are not as readily highlighted in the dominant accounts of the past. These include near universal employment, education, and literacy, post-war rebuilding, and industrialization. At the same time, we need to break away from the mainstream historiography to seek alternative views of the history. Therefore, let's look at how the above-mentioned new man identity shaped late socialism urban events in Nova Huta. Our story can be divided into two parts. The first is the solidarity movement in the 1960s, and the second is the workplace image in the 1990s. In the 1960s, due to the economic recession and political instability in Eastern Europe, the utopian image in Nova Huta started to diminish. The city was no longer self-sufficient. Price became higher while wage became lower. The discontent among workers began to aggregate, so workers started to form unions and negotiated with the government. However, the unions faced antagonism from the government with oppression and suppression. Meanwhile, other social problems that had been planted before also came into play. The most significant event was the uprising of the religious rights, where Catholics started to protest against the prohibition of religious activities. The bloody event took place on April 27, 1960, where authorities attempted to remove a cross at the site of the construction of the first Catholic church in Nova Huta. Catholics and protesters confronted with authorities and resulted in more than 4,000 people defending the cross. This event was not merely an oppression to the religious rights, as most literature suggests. Looking at this photo from the event, exhibited in Nova Huta Museum, Though it is not clear, but one can see different demographics of the protesters. There are men and women, children and elders, and different ethnicity groups such as Roman, Polish, and even Jewish. The driving force of this event was not only religion, but something more. It was shaped by the new man identity, in which the pursuit of equality and solidarity is highly valued. Most people there were very community-centered, so that when part of the community was suppressed, even unrelated people stood out to fight for their rights. The same idea lasted as the solidarity movement became more prevalent, and at its peak time, more than 80% of the population joined the movement to voice their disaffection and their pursuit of a better society. Another way of examining the new man identity is through the post-socialism Nowa Huta's workplace. According to Poland's Center for Social Opinion Research, 53% of the workers were registered to unions in 1997. Due to the impact of socialism, unions remained an influential force in the post-socialism era. Again, the new man identity, which was characterized by egalitarianism and utopian ideas, led to progressive workplace improvements in the capitalist society during the 1990s. As we can see from above, the ideological impact of Nowa Huta did not diminish after the collapse of Soviet Union. The new man identity originated from the city's layout and people's lifestyle still lasts in people's mind. As Watson suggested, existing literature on generation and memory teaches us that people's identities can be shaped by events they did not directly experience themselves, but memories of which have been passed down to them through various media of memory, including architecture, monuments, ritual, storytelling, and film. Going back from a city view, for example, in this photo by Piotr Tomaszewski in 2014, we can see that time hasn't left much impact on the city's outlook. There were no tall buildings, no modern infrastructures, and the city remained an utopian environment, even though that the ideology machine behind the place has changed. The new man identity of the city, which I believe was the embodiment of an ideal socialism with its emphasis on collectivism and egalitarianism, will still exert its shaping power to the city and its people. This is today's history analysis. Thank you very much. See you next time.